In today's economy, more people than ever are looking to buy and sell businesses. But how do you do it? Welcome to the Deal Board, presented by Transworld Business Advisors. Straight talk about real deals and real people. Listen to stories, interviews, and expert advice to help your business sale, merger, or acquisition process. Now, here are your business exit experts, Andy and Jessica.
Well, welcome back. Today, we're going to talk about landlord-specific issues when you're buying or selling a company. And right now, we're seeing the commercial real estate market really heat up in many areas of the country. Andy, what do we typically see in deals when that happens?
When the market heats up like this, landlords get greedy, or, even not even getting greedy, they're buying their real estate at higher prices, right? So they have a higher debt service. So therefore, they have to have a higher rent roll. So landlords are always looking during a time of rising prices and, lower inventory and plus there's a lot of money on the street. We've talked about that, or we will talk about how much money there is on the street, chasing investment. So when that happens, these landlords, when the renewals come up or there's a significant event in the lease, like a seller wanting to sell their business and sell to a buyer, they're going to try to take advantage of it. And we've been seeing that. And I think these are some of the stories that, that are pretty typical of what's going on. I mean, you've been seeing that in Denver, right?
Yeah, Denver's been a crazy market. We've experienced a big migration, which has just kicked the economy into high gear. And, we've seen the importance that people that want to sell their business, they really need to have great assignment clauses in their lease. They have to have great relationships with their landlord in order for us to get these leases transferred and get their businesses sold. But I think we have a couple great stories today. I don't know, is there anything else we should tell the listeners if they're thinking about selling their business or potentially buying a business, what they should expect in the commercial real estate piece?
Well, they should expect a number of things. First of all, they need to read their lease. I mean, so if you're going to sell your business, the first thing you have to do is read your lease. I just was sitting with a business owner where the lease is very important. And she said, gee, I really got to read this thing. And after she read it, there is a pretty sticky assignment clause. Number one, that keeps her on the lease. So you're going to see sellers are just going to have to expect that they're going to have to stay on the lease at least through the initial or, the remaining term of that lease, and perhaps even options with the buyer. And that's good and bad. The bad news is, of course, that they're still on the lease. The good news is if something goes wrong, the landlord's going to call them. And if they have a leave, seller financing, a leave behind money that they're collecting as well, it'll actually give them the opportunity to take back the business, which nobody wants to do, and it doesn't happen often. So that's number one. Number two is the buyers are going to have to personally guarantee. Most of the time, the buyers are going in there without as much experience as the seller. So the landlords are taking a risk by assigning the lease to someone who may not know the business as well. So the buyers are going to have to personally guarantee these and beyond, and perhaps even pay more. And perhaps, what we're seeing, and you'll hear it in some of the stories, are people having to leave a bigger deposit.
Yeah. We've even had some landlords too ask the buyers to develop business plans or prove that they have transferable experience. And I think those are just things that when a market's hot like this, that you're just going to have to be prepared for on either side of the deal. But I think we've got some great stories to go through today and some great examples to share with you.
Yeah, we do. So we'll kick that off.
Transworld Business Advisors is the world's largest business brokerage and mergers and acquisitions firm with over 500 brokers in nearly 200 offices worldwide. Transworld's team handles thousands of business sales every year. To be connected with a qualified business broker or learn more about the buying and selling process, visit tworld.com/the deal board or call 888-719-9098. Okay, so now we have with us Linnea Westlake from our San Diego North office. And Linnea's had a number of deals that have challenges related to landlord and lease issues. So Linnea, welcome to the Deal Board, and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in the market right now.
Well, Jessica, thank you. I really appreciate being invited to join this podcast related to working with landlords and specifically some of the challenges and opportunities that we run in with both from a seller and buyer side. And specifically, I want to focus my conversation around retail in San Diego, specifically the very highly sought after locations where the vacancy rate is low, the rents are very high, and there's a lot of competition for the space. And the first thing I just wanted to, highlight is that, on the topic of working with landlords, it can be quite a broad topic in the sense of who is the landlord? Is it a REIT? Is it a partnership, a family office, a trust? Is it an individual? Is it an individual owner operator of a business that wants to become the landlord? All of those different types of landlords have different types of agendas, and you want to be aware of that to the extent you can as you package the business for sale and start to work with potential buyers. Because sometimes, and I guess I have to say most of the time, the landlord is really not on the buy-sell team. They're almost regardless of the type, their mission is to make money off their property. And they really don't care necessarily whether the business buys or business sells or not. Particularly the property managers, they're very risk averse. So if they make no decision relative to approving a potential buyer for a lease transfer, that's a low risk move for them versus potentially taking on a new tenant that may not be as strong as the prior tenant. So these are just things that you want to be aware of when you start to work with the landlords. Their agenda is not necessarily the same as the buyer and the seller, I guess is what I wanted to say.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And even bringing up the point of who the landlord is, because, a REIT's going to operate very differently in their vetting process of a new owner than, an owner operator would that's just selling off their building. So I know you had some examples that you wanted to share and, some tactics that sellers could use on their side or things that they could be aware of. So why don't you jump into a little bit on the sell side, some examples and things to be aware of there?
Certainly. Well, for one thing, the sellers need to be aware that if they don't have a strong lease, they don't really have much to sell. So, for example, I've worked with several sellers that got behind for one reason or another, and sometimes of no fault of their own. For example, in two different instances, there were major floods based on, in one case, a fire hydrant got run into by a major truck and it saturated the roof of a building. And anyway, long and the short of it is this particular seller was out of business for several months. And yes, he had insurance, but the insurance payment, didn't come through in a timely fashion, and he managed to get behind. And that puts him at risk because he's in default of his lease. And so he turns around and a short period of time later wants to sell, and he's not in good stead with the landlord. And that landlord may have a different agenda. That landlord may be hoping for a loophole, a reason to, in essence, boot the seller because he wants to, sell the property or repurpose the property. And so those are some of the things that you need to think of. I had another seller, another similar situation. They lost a $160,000 deal, as did the buyer and as did I, because they weren't aware of the agenda in and around what that particular property manager / landlord had in mind. And so they, again, allowed themselves to get behind and ended up without, really an offer in hand that they couldn't execute because they were being booted out of their premises.
Yeah, and these retail businesses, like we say, location is everything, right? Location. And that's a great point. If you're behind in your rent, you don't really have a lot of negotiating power at that point, if any, right? So I think those are great points and great examples. And things happen, right? We all know things happen in business, but it just makes it a little bit harder to negotiate with those landlords.
Well, and the other thing that I've seen happen is that the seller knows that they want to retire and their lease is coming due, and they make the mistake of electing not to renew the option because they don't want to be there long term. So then we end up in a situation where somewhere along the line, they roll into a month to month. And once that happens, again, we have very little leverage with the property manager and landlord. I have been able to get some of those done because of it just so happened that we lucked out with a strong buyer that was, going to, from the perspective of the property manager, improve the, not only reduce the risk relative to because of their financial capacity and solvency and experience, but theoretically improve the center. But I've also had situations where, the seller has gone month to month, and the property manager says, we don't really care if that place continues to be, for example, a dry cleaner drop store, and we don't really care if it continues to be an ice cream shop. And and so at that point, you've basically opened up the opportunity for them to just say no for, much less reason than they might say no when it's simply a lease transfer.
Right. Those are all great points. So in that you mentioned a strong buyer. So give us some examples of what you've seen of how the landlord's going to look at the buyer or the new owner of the business.
Absolutely. So the first thing that it's very important for the buyers to understand is that when we, as the business intermediary helping them pursue a business, ask for financials, I often get the response, well, I'm going to pay cash, so you don't need to know all my financials. And my response is, well, that's actually not true. The seller may not care if you pay cash, but I still have to get you past the landlord. And the landlord, most of the landlords, at least in this area, again, prime locations, they have clauses in the leases that say that they don't have to transfer to a buyer that doesn't have the same or better net worth and experience as the seller. So I might have a very good buyer, but they don't have the same level of financial capacity and experience, and the landlord could attempt to turn them down. The other thing that they need to know is that the seller is typically held accountable to the lease upon transfer until the end of whatever the term is. And that means the seller does care about
right.
the depth of the buyer's financial capacity, because in essence, the landlord's going back to them if the buyer defaults. So I guess my message to the buyers is that cash is great. It certainly speeds the acquisition process, but you have to be worthy of the lease in the eyes of the property manager, especially, because that person's role is to mitigate risk and make sure that they get paid, that their landlord gets paid, and that they put together a package that is compelling relative to not only their financial net worth, meaning all their assets, all their liabilities, and what do they have at the end of the day. They need to be able to show some liquidity. Again, my example before where, a couple different instances where sellers there was damage to the property and they had to shut down for a period of months. Both the landlord and the seller want to know that new tenant could carry the operational expenses even if they're closed down for a period of time, or at least their living expenses. Granted, yes, insurance comes through, but insurance doesn't always come through in the most timely manner. So when you complete your financial information as a buyer, you really need to be strong and you need to be complete and thorough. Those property managers that I've run into are sticklers. They don't like the sloppy, incomplete data, right?
Yeah, like you said, they're trying to mitigate risk, right? So they need to have every bit of information possible.
Exactly. And the only other thing I would say is that if you're an extremely wealthy buyer, then perhaps you don't have to share the fact that you're worth 25 or 50 million, but you do need to share enough to make both the seller and the landlord comfortable that they won't be left holding the bag.
Yeah, that you're at least able to cover the lease,
Exactly. And then on beyond that, they want to see that you have experience. And so if you're coming in and this is you're buying a little business and it's the first time that you're going to be an entrepreneur, you really need to beef up your CV and business plan to provide confidence that you can be successful in this business. And sometimes it won't work at all if you're not coming to the table with experience. Other times it will, but you really need to make sure that you demonstrate that you know what you're doing. And you can sort of determine whether or not it's going to work based on who the seller is. For example, I have a sub shop on the market, and that seller walked in with zero experience and was approved and has a lease and has an extended lease. And so I probably can bring in a first-time buyer to that location and get it approved, assuming they have the financials and a good business plan. In a different situation, if I'm following a seller, that owns multiple retail businesses and, they've been doing it for 25 years and the buyer, is a first-time entrepreneur, it may not get approved just on that alone.
Yeah, it's always, it's always situational, but the more transferable experience you can provide these landlords, just like banks, right, is always better. But I think this is all great information for the listeners, Linnea, and thank you so much for sharing it. To summarize for our listeners, one, know what type of landlord you're working with and what the agenda of that landlord is going to be. Two, if you're a seller, make sure that you have a good standing lease and a good relationship with that landlord. And then three, if you're a buyer, make sure that you can provide the financial and experience backing that's going to make these landlords and property managers feel comfortable with the deal. So thank you again so much, Linnea. It was great having you on the show, and we look forward to hearing again from you soon.
Jessica, thanks so much. A pleasure to be here.
Hey, Jessica, you know what time it is?
Money time?
Almost. It's time for listing of the week. Hey, it's time for listing of the week, and we have Randy Bring from our Boca Raton office with a new listing that he really likes. So, Randy, take it away.
Hello, everybody. Randy Bring here. I am so excited to tell you about my newest client. This is a 22-year-old business based in Fort Lauderdale, and they are in the paintless dent removal business, PDR as it's known in the industry. And what do? Well, using a mobile system, they provide services mostly to new car dealerships where the owner or one of his techs appears at the dealership on a regular basis and essentially removes dents from new and used vehicles, thus preventing the dealer from having to send the car off their lot and sending it to a very expensive body shop. They do business with a dozen or more new car dealer franchises in Broward County. They also do business with a lot of the used car lots. And of course, they also do business directly to the public where they have a shop and you can drive your vehicle in. They typically charge between $65 and $90 to remove a dent. It can take anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour. Their relationships with their clients, mostly, again, the new car dealers extend back, some of them 10, 12, 15 years. It's a great business, tax return records. This year, the company is projecting a net operating income, that is an owner's benefit to a working owner, of about $165,000. Again, all on the financials, all tax return business. They are asking $300,000, and we're in the process of getting this business SBA pre-qualified.
Well, that's a great opportunity, less than 2 times down, and obviously with financing involved, might be very easy for someone to get into that business. Thanks, Randy. Great job.
All right, welcome back. Today we have with us Darrow Graham from our Grapevine, Texas office, and we're talking about landlord issues and lease issues and how they can be big problems in closing a deal. And Darrow has a specific story to share with us where it actually caused the deal to die. So Darrow, why don't you jump in, introduce yourself, and tell us a little bit about this deal and what happened.
Okay, my name is Darrow Graham. I own the Grapevine, Texas territory. And this deal happened over a year ago. It was actually the second deal that I listed. So obviously, when you're brand new in the office, very excited about the opportunity, and the structure of the deal was pretty nice. It's a pretty large antique mall in Colleyville, Texas. The owner had it for over 10 years, and 97, 100% occupancy at all times. Had a great reputation, a lot of traffic. His SDE was around 149,000. And he did over $1.6 million in volume. So it was a nice deal. He was ready to retire. His background was in medical. He'd been a CFO for a big health organization. So, pretty smart guy, pretty savvy businessman. And but he was ready, for someone to come in and take the reins. So I came in and got it listed. And through the process, and this really happened at the end, when he told me about a clause that was in his lease that he felt like forced to negotiate with the landlord, because what had happened is some real estate developers came in and they bought this strip mall and they overpaid for it by the tune of about $3 million. And so the way they thought they would recoup that was to come in and start raising the rents with all of the tenants in the strip mall. And the owner pushed back really hard to say that you can't get that type of market rent. And if you do, I can't be successful and my business will go out of business. So there was a big negotiation back and forth. And what they ended up agreeing upon was to put a 90-day out in the contract, meaning if the developer came in and found a tenant that would pay market rent, then the owner had 90 days to vacate, and vice versa. So if the owner of this antique mall decided that he just didn't want to do this anymore, he could give them 90 days. And so when I found out about that, of course, I raised the issue and basically told him that this business is going to be unsellable unless you can get that clause removed, which he thought that he could. For the main reason was because there was a lot of construction that was going on up and down this particular road, and there were a lot of businesses that were suffering because of it. And the landlord had not had any real interest in that particular space anyway, and the space was pretty tricky because it had actually been split up, and he had expanded. There were some abatement issues. There was, you couldn't put a dock door in the back, so it was a really tricky piece of real estate for someone to move in, even if he had a tenant. So he just felt like, hey, I've got a new owner that could potentially come in, sign another 5-year lease, and you guys will get your rent. So he's like, let me take care of it. I know the guy really well. We'll go play golf and all that good stuff and get it resolved. Well, end of the day, he never got it resolved. And this really went on for over a year. I originally had it listed at 410,000. And as I told the owner, I said, as soon as I tell people about this 90-day out, no one's going to take that kind of a risk. And so as I had people come through, we would talk through it, and he really had no interest from that. So we, over a period of a year, as the construction got worse out there in front of his place, his numbers started to suffer, and we reduced the price drastically and to 95,000. And we worked a deal where if we could just bring somebody into the mall and he could train them and basically just replace his salary, and they could learn over about a 6 to 9 month period, knowing full well that they're going to have to get the tenants and find a new place to move, then maybe someone would agree to some deal like that, some sort of an earn-out. But ultimately that didn't happen. His business continued to suffer, and he actually gave the 90-day out to the landlord about 60 days ago. So he's currently liquidating as we speak.
Wow. So it's, really powerful, some of how these things in your lease that you don't typically look at, some of these clauses like this, in this case, the 90-day out clause, can really affect your business and whether it can be sold and what it can be sold for in the future. So looking back at the situation, Darrow, what advice would you give to business owners that are in a lease negotiation like this. I mean, it's happening fairly often across the country now too, that commercial real estate is being bought and sold and new owners are coming in. What advice would you give to somebody in that situation when they're looking at renegotiating some lease terms?
Well, obviously don't sign a 90-day out,
Yeah.
but I think, this particular owner he was a very savvy businessman. And he went back and forth with this landowner over a long period of time. And it ended up being, he felt like the only thing that he could do to keep his rent stabilized during that time period, but not knowing, I think he felt that he could negotiate that back out now that he had it on the market, and we could bring in a potential owner that would sign a 5-year lease. Because he says, in a year and a half, I'm out, I'm retired, I'm done. It was part of a very large real estate conglomerate, if you will, and they can handle a space being vacant for however long it's going to be vacant. So yeah, I would say things like that, and then if you have a new buyer coming in, that they're able to negotiate a deal with a landlord where it's not an assignment. It's better to get a master lease so there's not any liability on the seller once they move on. And a lot of times sellers don't realize that. They think that, oh, if I just do this assignment and now you take care of the rent, then I'm done, only to find out that they're actually still liable for the length of that lease, and they're better off to get a master lease. So that's something that I would certainly advise sellers as they're negotiating with the landlord in the beginning and as they get closer to selling their business.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, with the master lease versus the assignment. And I know, in future podcasts, we're going to talk a lot about that personal guarantee that's on those leases and how they do follow the seller sometimes, after the business is sold, that they're still liable for the full length of that lease from a financial perspective.
That happened to me on a different deal. One of the very first deals that I got. And sometimes you just don't know what you don't know. And the buyer had negotiated the assignment with the landlord, and even the buyer didn't realize, and I didn't realize that they were on the hook with that personal guarantee going forward. And in the end, after it closed, the seller was upset and kind of upset with me that I didn't catch it, but I didn't know it was in there.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great point. Well, thank you so much, Darrow, for joining us today and sharing the story for the listeners. And we hope to have you back on the podcast again soon.
All right. Sounds good.
Hey, Andy, you know what time I think it is? I think it's time to talk about our deal of the week.
Deal of the week. We're back with the deal of the week. And this week, we're going to talk about a small business, but they're all good ones. And they serve purposes. I mean, it gives people jobs. And we're with Randy Bring and from our Boca Raton office. And he had a small sandwich shop that he's going to tell you about. Randy?
Well, Andy, they say that good things come in small packages, and this was a great deal, though it was a very small deal, but maybe not by the standards of my seller or my buyer. I represented a small business, a sandwich shop located in a business office park, meaning that they're only open Monday through Friday. They close about 4:00 in the afternoon. And our seller was actually a retired police officer who had bought this out of retirement, had some fun with it 4 or 5 years, and decided it was time to move on to his real retirement. We found the perfect buyer. It took us a couple weeks. The buyer was a young man with a little bit of restaurant and food and beverage experience. He was actually immigrating from Europe. He needed the visa and was able to write a check for $75,000 for this business. Business only made $35,000, $38,000, but it accomplished the buyer's goal of making just enough money to live on, to get his visa, and of course for our seller, it allowed him to provide a week or two of training and move on to the next phase in his life, which was full retirement.
Great example of good deals for good people. Thanks, Randy. Thanks for coming on today. So we're back and we're talking about landlords, and I've got Eric Straus from New York. Eric, welcome to the show again.
Hey, Andy. Thanks a lot. How you doing?
Good. So, it's always interesting to hear about some of the hottest markets in the United States as far as landlords are concerned. And I know landlords are a big issue when selling deals in New York City. So why don't you give us some stories that you've seen out there on the streets?
So I don't know how it is in the rest of the country, but in New York, there's no such thing as a nice landlord. And I'm going to try to keep this clean, but they're really pretty nasty. The question is just how nasty they are. And sort of, some of our stories that we've had over the years. Not that long ago, we had a seller who was very overdue in his rent that he owed the landlord, and we had not found that out. We brought a buyer who had done his due diligence and went to the landlord to get the lease assignment approved. And the landlord basically, shafted the seller and leased the space to the buyer and evicted the seller. So not a very nice move.
Yeah, we've seen that before. I mean, that's, really important. That it's a great lesson to all our sellers is that you really have to make sure that you're up to date on your rent and you're paying your rent. I mean, that's crazy. So you could really get thrown out. And these landlords are aggressive, certainly in places where they can rent things easily.
Absolutely. Yep. Another thing that happened, and I have not seen this a lot, and I was amazed, is we had this fantastic deal where we had a gym basically sold, had a buyer very excited. It was sort of a half spinning, half yoga place, sort of a very cool idea. And the buyers, and shame on us for not having seen this earlier, the buyer is reading through the lease and calls us up and says, do you realize that half the transaction price the seller gets has to go to the landlord? It's right here in the lease.
Yeah, we've seen that before. It's crazy. I've seen that in malls and some very high rent districts where the landlord will be very aggressive in the beginning and put something in there. I've seen it say something like, if the business is sold for more than the assets that were originally included in the deal, that the landlord gets all the proceeds. So basically, if you build goodwill and you sell it, it's crazy. So that's another great thing. I mean, people need to read their leases before they get into them. So
I hate to be the one saying great things about lawyers, but I think signing a real estate lease is a great time to hire a real estate lawyer.
There you go. There you go. Great point. All right. Anything else?
Yeah, I had a deal, a very good Colombian buyer with a lot of cash who wanted to buy a restaurant. And the landlord required a 12-month security deposit. And I think it was something like $14,000 a month of rent. So we're talking about, what's that, $180,000-ish of deposit that the landlord wanted because he said, hey, if this guy runs away to Colombia, it's going to be hard for me to collect. I need 12 months of security deposit. So,
yeah, we've seen that before too. If the buyer doesn't have credit here in the country, then they're going to have to put up a very large security deposit, which could be up to a year. I've seen even more than that sometimes. So it's pretty crazy.
Yeah, no question about it. Look, here in the city, there's a lot of good retail for rent, and landlords are pretty rough to deal with.
All right. Talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks, Andy. Appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning into our show today. If you like the podcast, don't forget to subscribe through your favorite podcasting app and leave us a review. If you have questions or suggestions for the show, visit us at tworld/thedealboard or email us at thedealboard@tworld.com.